Hi, everyone. Thank you for watching this presentation. My name is Mia, and this presentation is what makes intentional teaching intentional, intentionality, and the active decision-making process in intentional teaching. So here is a brief overview of this presentation. I'll start by looking at my rationale and methods for conducting this literature review. Then I will discuss intentional teaching from two aspects: intentionality and the active decision-making process. I'll conclude this presentation by looking at the implication of our finding. So first of all, why intentional teaching? Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Mia, and I'm currently a PhD student at Deakin University in Australia. My PhD project looks at Australian early childhood teachers' perceptions and implementation of intentional teaching in the outdoor learning environment. I'm also an early childhood teacher. I was trained 7 years ago. And in my training, one thing always intrigued me, which is intentional teaching. It sounds very self-explanatory. You teach with intention. However, when I started teaching, it became one of the most difficult things for me to do. I noticed myself got caught up by the routines, by the conversations with the families every day. And I noticed that I didn't really have time and I didn't know how to do intentional teaching anymore, especially when I noticed that my colleagues all had different understanding to me about intentional teaching. And this has led me to my PhD study. After a look at the literature, I noticed that there's an uptake of intentional teaching in global early childhood contexts, and this has contributed to the shift in understandings of pedagogical play to a more social cultural perspective. For example, in the Australian context here, intentional teaching is explicitly highlighted for early childhood sector as a key pedagogical practice in the National Early Years Learning Framework, which came out in 2009. However, recent studies have highlighted educators' struggles in conceptualizing their roles as intentional teachers in play-based programs. Educators can see play-based learning and intentional teaching as a pedagogical binary, as they regard play-based learning as maintaining children's agency in free play, and intentional teaching as leading children towards certain learning outcomes through direct instructions. There's also a lack of practice guidance on how to integrate intentional teaching with play-based learning, so I was not alone. So the aim of this literature review is to develop a conceptual framework of intentional teaching with the focus of the outdoor space, which will be used in my research project. So in this review, I looked at studies related to intentional teaching in early childhood context, published in English between 2010 and 2020, and I identified 64 papers. So now let's look at intentionality. So why should we focus on intentionality? In the literature review, I noticed that there's a lack of clarity around intention and intentionality. For example, in the Australian context, educators' teaching practices are guided by the Early Years Learning Framework, which highlights that intentional teaching requires educators to be deliberate, purposeful, and thoughtful in the decisions and actions. However, it does not further specify what exactly is the intention that educators use to guide their decision-making and actions. And recent research has explored an impact on children's learning outcomes in the early childhood context of having learning objectives or intentions. However, only a few studies have closely examined the meaning of intention in relation to intentional teaching. And this may have led to the confusions and misinterpretation of what intentional teaching actually means among educators and also early childhood teaching preparation programs. So in this presentation, I will explore intentional teaching from both educators' intentionality and children's intentionality. According to Legge and Ford, both of them are critical to successful implementation of intentional teaching in play-based programs. When educators and children co-construct their knowledge of the world through negotiation of shared meanings, communication, cooperation, or even conflicts, they develop this bidirectional relationship in learning, which is called the teacher-learner nexus, which is a key consideration in intentional teaching. So what is educators' intentionality? Based on the definition from Epstein, intentional teaching means teachers act with specific outcomes or goals in mind for children's development and learning. Ideally, intentional teachers draw on research evidence regarding critical skills, knowledge, and concepts for children to learn to inform their curriculum decision-making. The second source that shapes educators' choices of intentional teaching goals are the predetermined outcomes often specified in curriculum documents across international early childhood education and care policies. For example, in the Australian context, educators need to draw on the learning outcomes outlined in the early years learning framework when they're planning for the curriculum and also decision-making. These outcomes focus on children's sense of identity, sense of community, well-being, learning dispositions, and communication skills. Drawing on the literature on relational pedagogy, here I would like to highlight another major focus for intentional teaching, which is relationship. From my own experience as a teacher, this is something that we do every day, but we sometimes don't identify it as intentional teaching. However, there are a number of studies showing that positive adult-child relationship enables children to establish a sense of security, which leads to exploration and engagement in the learning environment. Intentional relationship building requires educators to respect children as capable and knowledgeable learners who are able to connect learning with prior learning experiences. These close relationships then enable educators to gather in-depth understanding of children's learning and development, which is indispensable in the decision-making for intentional teaching. Educators can also utilize these positive relationships as a tool to promote aspects of learning across developmental domains. While educators' intentionality has often been highlighted as a key factor in effective intentional teaching, children's intentionality is less discussed in the literature. Intentional learning involves the decision to participate in the learning experience, as well as the commitment and persistence to follow through. So in this sense, children's intentionality is connected to the agency in learning, taking ownership for their thoughts and actions to achieve learning outcomes and construct knowledge. Including children's intentionality in the discussion of intentional teaching is aligned with the recent shift of the image of the child. Further, when children's agency is respected and promoted in learning, they develop positive learning dispositions and a strong sense of identity, belonging, and well-being, which contributes to their holistic development, and this sits well with the outcome framework, for example, the early years learning framework in Australia. When educators take children's intentionality into account when planning for and implementing their intentional teaching practices, they establish this co-constructing relationship with children, which Leggett and Ford described as the teacher-learner nexus. Recognizing the child as an intentional learner allows educators to shift their perceptions of children from being knowledge receivers to active knowledge constructors. And this may hence support educators to reconceptualize their roles as one that promotes children's intrinsic drives for independent learning, rather than merely the provider of knowledge. And this shift in thinking may also help to mitigate the perceived tension between intentional teaching and play-based learning, where educators see teaching and playing having competing interests. So if we look at children's agency and their intentionality, when they're engaging in play, they're actually directing and engaging in learning as they interact with the people, environments, and materials, rather than just aimlessly occupying themselves with activities. And therefore, where we recognize children's intentionality and take initiatives to respond to children's learning needs at opportune timing, we are actually co-constructing the knowledge with children within the play context instead of interrupting the play. So now let's move on to look at the decision-making process. Why is our decision-making process so important? Well, while everything we do in the learning environment should be part of our intentional teaching, not all intentions are seen as leading to practices that are considered as intentional teaching. Take this picture as an example. It's raining and the children noticed the water puddle and they started to jump into it. Educator Mary may decide to stand back because this keeps children occupied, while educator Emma might choose to do so based on the intention of providing children opportunities to explore cause and effect. Though both actions appear similar, educator Emma demonstrates more teaching intentionality in the decision-making of the next steps. Based on the previous example, we can see that intentional teaching sometimes cannot simply be observed because what makes educators' actions intentional is the decision-making process regarding the intentionality. So in order to illustrate this decision-making process, I've drawn on the human intentional action model from Tomasello and colleagues and the early years planning cycle to develop this active decision-making process diagram, which is shown on this page. Here, I use the word active to illustrate educators' autonomy in the process, as they constantly act and actively seek information, assess the situation, and adapt their roles to enhance children's learning. According to Tomasello and colleagues, individuals' intentional actions involve three interrelated factors: goal, action, and perceptual monitoring. In this diagram, goal refers to the learning goals the educator has for each child, which is illustrated as the open box on the top. Based on the goal, the educator engages in active decision-making, drawing on knowledge and skills in extending children's thinking, which is illustrated as the hand, as well as the understanding of children's current learning progress, which is illustrated as the closed box. The active decision-making process informs the intention, which then drives the action. Meanwhile, the educator monitors the situation through observation to determine three things. Firstly, children's learning progress. And second, whether the action is executed as intended. And lastly, the result caused by the action. The educator then critically reflects on the information gathered through observation and proceeds to the next cycle of decision-making. This process of active and ongoing decision-making shows the nature of teaching in early childhood and is at the core of successful implementation of intentional teaching in play-based learning. So what does that mean? Though the framework in Australia places educators' active role at the core of its definition of intentional teaching, evidence shows that educators often struggle to conceptualize their role as intentional teachers. They tend to assume that intentional teaching is only associated with interactions and explicit teaching, which may be caused by the ambiguity of the term active. So I would like to advocate for a broader view of educators' role in intentional teaching by focusing on the intentionality behind decisions and actions, rather than limiting the roles to certain actions. What makes educators' decisions and actions intentional is their intentionality, knowing how and what they want children to learn. And their intentionality is formed through the active decision-making process. By focusing on the intentionality, educators are able to plan and adapt their intentional teaching practices based on the children's strengths, needs, content, and also their context. They find opportune times to step in and out of children's play with the intention to enhance children's learning. At times, educators may choose to step back and observe children's play in order to facilitate observation, exploration, and peer scaffolding, even though this may seem inactive. Therefore, greater emphasis should be placed on the decision-making process so educators can justify their chosen actions based on their professional knowledge and knowledge of the child. That brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any thoughts, feedback, question, please contact me by email on the screen. Thank you very much for your time.